English at Ryerson University. Her first book, Bounding Biomedicine, Evidence and Rhetoric in the New Science of Alternative Medicine, was recently published with University of Chicago Press. Congratulations, by the way.
Thanks.
We will be chatting today about Colleen's article that will be published in our inaugural issue of Rhetoric of Health and Medicine, titled The Self-Generating Language of Wellness and Natural Health, as well as Colleen's larger project on wellness and illness. And I think I saw that your latest book project on your Twitter is titled The Wellness Drug, Natural Health in a Biomedical Culture. Exciting stuff. So, very first question. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing this author's name correctly, but part of this project seems to be the extension of Karenins. Is that right? Karenins?
Yep.
2010 initial investigation of autopoiesis, or self-reproduction, as a rhetorical phenomenon. In your article, you write that Karenin draws the concept of autopoiesis from social systems theory, where it was in turn drawn from biology to characterize living systems such as cells as closed, autonomous, self-replicating units. I really love this framework a lot. So I'm wondering what initially drew you to this as an analytical framework for rhetoric of health and medicine specifically? And what advice would you offer to other scholars who are interested in using this particular framework for their analysis?
That's a great question. So the idea of autopoiesis as a rhetorical phenomenon, I first came across it. So Lisa, Karenin, and I participated in a symposium organized by Judy Siegel, I think it was about 2008 or 9, and she presented there on her research about bioweapons and viral apocalypse and disaster preparedness. And so that's where she first introduced this concept, and she wrote it up into a chapter in a collection called Rhetorical Questions in Health and Medicine. And so that's where I first came across it. And I was really excited by the possibilities of the framework. At the time, I was working on stuff that didn't really, fit with it. So just kind of stuck it in the back of my mind. And it wasn't until I was working on this new project about wellness, and I conducted a set of interviews with individuals, 20 in all, people who identify themselves as interested in wellness and natural health. And it wasn't, I had a hypothesis going into this project about what the language of wellness is and what it does. And my hypothesis had been that the language of wellness, or the concept of wellness itself, had been medicalized. It had been reframed in medical terms as a treatable condition, in a sense. And so I'd gone in with this idea, and I found in my data that was true, that people did talk about wellness as if it were a kind of disease, that's something that needed to be monitored and maintained, that you needed to take some kind of external support for, in this case, natural health products rather than pharmaceuticals. But there was something else happening in the data that I couldn't really make sense of, and I hadn't been prepared for it. And that's where autopoiesis really came in. It became a framework that helped explain what I saw happening in the text, because as I discuss in the article, the participants, they collapsed or moved between two very different frameworks for understanding wellness, and often even in the same breath. So on the one hand, they would talk about wellness as a kind of an illness or a risk of illness that governed their behavior, because they would engage in behaviors to try to mitigate threats to their wellness. So things like managing mood, managing energy levels, etc. Digestion is a big one. But then they would also use this language that I really am drawing on Carl Elliott's work about enhancement and enhancement technologies, where they would talk about wellness as a form of enhancement. So not trying to fix something that's wrong, but trying to enhance something to make yourself as good as you can be, or to be better than well, as Elliott says. And that's really where autopoiesis became useful for me to think about in this project, because these two different, in the article I call them the logics of wellness. There's two logics of wellness: the logic of restoration, or restoring the body to a state of previous functioning. That's the kind of illness sort of logic. And then wellness, the logic of enhancement, which is that logic of trying to become better than you already are. The tension between those two logics seemed to me to be fueling this discourse In other words, it seemed to actually help drive it. So it's not just that the participants in my study were kind of, waffling between these two perspectives, but actually these two perspectives sort of drove their interest in wellness. And autopoiesis really fit quite perfectly as an explanation for this, because it takes into account a broader context for communication, looking at kind of a whole range of different factors that contribute to how a discourse kind of moves and perpetuates. And so I drew on Karenin's introduction of this. Karen is the one that introduced the concept to rhetorical studies sort of in general. And she said that she uses the concept heuristically. So she doesn't, engage with all aspects of autopoiesis in an in-depth and comprehensive way, but uses it as kind of a lever for opening up discussions in health and medicine. And so this project seemed like kind of the perfect opportunity to extend and expand that concept, applying it to a new context, applying it to, I guess a new context, and just understanding a little bit more about how it works. There's a couple differences because when Karenin looks at it, she looks at how the terror preparedness industry kind of exploits the concept of risk to drive interest in preparedness activities, basically to enhance their own market. And that's true in my case as well, but my case it's a little fuzzier because there aren't specifically identifiable players. So I'm looking more kind of at the ambient rhetorics of wellness, all of the ways in which we think about our bodies and ourselves in commercial terms, but also, in personal kind of self-developmental kind of ways. So I'm looking at kind of a little bit of a broader slice in one sense, sort of building on that concept that Karenin introduced.
Very, very cool. Yeah. And so speaking of context, one of the things that I really kept thinking about as I was reading your article was, first of all, these tensions, but also natural health products, or what you call NHPs in particular. I was really thinking about the ways that I see these things playing out on social media in particular, and specifically Instagram. I feel like I see a lot of this sort of wellness discourse happening on Instagram. And I don't know if you're familiar with Instagram, but in general, do you see specific areas of discourse that seem to be more prone to these kinds of self-perpetuating rhetorics?
That's a great question. And I think so. I haven't gone deep into that part of the project yet, but that will be in the eventual book that I'm working on. Right now, the structure of the book, and it's early days. I've got a lot of data and a lot of stuff, but it's sort of in an amorphous shape right now. But right now, what I'm thinking is that the book will look at different vectors of wellness. So the different sort of means through which the idea of wellness circulates in the broader culture. As I say in the article, we know really very well now that the idea of wellness sells, right? We know that because Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop website is, a cultural phenomenon. We know that because of the Food Babe and all kinds of other stuff. We know that because we see supplements for sale at big box stores now. So it's no longer kind of a fringe health trend, but we don't yet know why it sells. We don't know really what are the drivers behind it. And so in the book that will be, I'm unpacking the different vectors, the different movers of this discourse. And one of the sort of, I think it's a chapter, might be a section, is about wellness as a kind of performance. And you see that a lot on social media. And so I'm thinking about the idea of virtue signaling. I don't really love that phrase because I think it suggests a kind of superficiality or vapidness that I don't think really reflects what's going on when people perform their wellness in, for example, social media spaces. But there is a performative aspect to wellness and I think a lot of that boils down to ideas of good health citizenship. So what does it mean to be a responsible, good health citizen? And that concept of health citizenship, again, I explore that in the article, but it really comes from neoliberal models of health, where we are all responsible for maintaining and enhancing our own health. And that's usually sort of paired vis-a-vis public health. And so not only do we want to be good health citizens, but I think we want to be seen to be good health citizens. And so that's something that I see circulating in online culture. I mean, if you click on the hashtag wellness on Instagram or Twitter, you get all kinds of stuff. I haven't begun to mine that yet, but I think that there really is. I mean, there's a performative element, but of course, there's also a lot of sponsorship embedded in those contexts. So that's something that I haven't yet teased apart, but I think it's a super interesting and promising area. So you'll have to stay tuned about that. But the performance of wellness, I think, is really important mover of wellness in contemporary culture, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sort of related, I was really interested in this idea of the goalposts as constantly being moving, where folks are trying to kind of like reach 100, but it's this sort of impossible goal. I thought that was really something interesting that came out from your interviews.
Yeah, that was something that I mean, it didn't surprise me, I guess. What did surprise me was how pervasive the idea was. That one participant in my study talked about wellness being kind of on the gas gauge of a car, that it's really easy to get down to empty. And you can kind of easily fill it up to about 3/4 of the way full. Like it's, you just get more sleep, blah, blah, blah. But then getting it to full is pretty much impossible. It's almost like trying to fill a bucket that has a hole in the bottom of it. Your wellness is always leaking out. And if you think in terms of, capitalist economies, that's the perfect scenario, right? Because if you have a population that knows that they're supposed to take charge of their health and, be good health citizens by, eating their vegetables and getting their sleep and their exercise, and getting support through, for example, supplements, through various alternative health regimens, through various, meditation, yoga, like you name it. There's kind of a perpetual market there. You can exploit that, right? So that's something that I think I think it's important to open up, because for people who engage in wellness oriented behaviors and natural health, and that's most of us, statistically speaking, I say this, and then I'm going to head off to my yoga class, and I'm going to, so we're all embedded in this. But I think about like my yoga class and how tired I am. And I think that all fits together, because I think we're all collectively exhausted. We're spent. We're emotionally spent from our jobs, from watching, world politics unfold around us, from every corner of our lives. I think we're exhausted, we're spent, we're maxed out. And I think that, it's very, very hard to change big, broad, cultural, systemic problems. It's much easier to feel good about yourself by, going down to Whole Foods or, I don't know, CVS or somewhere and buying a supplement and, making sure you get a better sleep that night. And I think that that's kind of a little vortex we get kind of drawn into. And so much of when we engage in wellness oriented behaviors, again, I'm saying sort of statistically, most of us feel like we're operating outside of the mainstream pharmaceutical, illness oriented system. And what I have found in my research is that whatever this new system is that we think we're engaging in, the rules and the language and the motivations and purposes, consequences, they're all the same as the originating. Like we're not getting out of any kind of, we're not escaping from that system. We're just kind of operating in it has slightly different terms, but it operates in the same way.
Yeah, and you have a really nice passage in your article that says something that I want to read it for our viewers, and then I have kind of a follow-up question that touches on what you're just talking about. So you say, in wellness discourse, taking action is always the right answer. In this sense, although the concept of wellness seems to empower individuals by offering independence from an illness-oriented biomedical model, contemporary understandings of wellness seem, instead, largely to expand the ways in which we can be ill or pre-ill and the forms of intervention we require. Consequently, and this is the part that I really find striking, consequently, the idea of wellness may do as much to create medical patients as it does to liberate them. So what does this mean for the everyday individual person? Is there a way to truly be empowered within this kind of discourse? And can we ever sort of escape? We're trying to escape and we're just ending up in this other system. Is there any escape?
I mean, the optimist in me would like to say yes. I don't know though, to be honest, I don't know. And I don't know because now I'm in Canada, and Canada and the US have, a very different understanding of health and healthcare in some, really essential ways. And so I can't speak to the American context as much. My first book was about American medicine and American health, so I have some insight, but I think those distinctions aside, we still see health as a market commodity. We still see health as something that can be bought, can be sold. Um, I think what we really need is systemic change. I think we need to go, really far upstream and look at how research studies are funded. For example, we need to look at who's paying for what studies, because we know that sponsorship of clinical trials of pharmaceuticals, for example, directly influences trial outcomes. We know that. We know that industry involvement in regulatory decision making skews in favor of industry. Those are things that we know. I think we crave a return to the natural and the pure. And that's totally understandable. But I think in that craving, we lose sight of the fact that supplement companies are often their parent companies are often pharmaceutical companies. Mm-hmm. Natural health products, dietary supplements are synthesized in labs just like pharmaceuticals. They're packaged like pharmaceuticals, they're sold like pharmaceuticals. And I think that those are things that are very easy to lose sight of because there's such a strong appeal in those products, because they are, or at least are ostensibly made of natural products that are not synthesized in the same way. Like they feel somehow more authentic. They feel somehow like, in my first book, I gave the example of St. John's wort, and how someone with depression who maybe has seen a bunch of different doctors who have never, haven't been very compassionate, who have just, tossed over a prescription for an antidepressant and said, try this. It might give you lots of side effects, but maybe it will make you feel better. To someone who has felt sort of lost in the system, then something like St. John's wort could be appealing because it's associated with, a tiny flower, and it's something that they can go themselves to the store and buy. They can choose how much they want to take, when they want to take it. It really seems to offer quite a lot of agency. I think, however, in that process of sort of gaining agency or feeling like you're gaining agency, it's easy to lose sight of kind of the broader context, which is you're still now, this is where antidepressants maybe aren't the best example, but you're still dependent on an external intervention to manage your body, or to think about your body and the ways you engage in the world. And so if we think about, moving away from something like depression to something more like sleep aids, that becomes, a much more clear example, because a lot of times insomnia is a product of poor sleep hygiene, or it's the product of us being overtaxed, overspent, exhausted at the end of the day, but wired, and unable to sleep because we're really stressed out. And so I think that, is there a way out? I think we would have to really redefine our relationship to the pharmaceutical industry. We'd have to really redefine our relationship between commerce and health. I think we'd really have to embrace a much more expansive appreciation of public health, community health, looking at our lives much more holistically. And I think that's the tricky part. And that's where, as a rhetorician, I feel like I can bring us to the door of asking these questions, but I can't take us through that door, because I can't solve that problem. I can point out and say, these are the things that are happening in this discourse. Here's why I think they might be problematic. But that's sort of the limit of my own analysis is, I'm really good at pointing out problems, and I really am not good at offering solutions, except really big, hard ones.
Well, this does bring up, the role of rhetoricians and of scholars in this context. You say at the end of your article that these spaces and these institutions and these discursive contexts are they're an opportunity for scholars in rhetoric and health and medicine to do this kind of work. To what extent would you say that it's also maybe our responsibility to do this kind of work as well?
That's a great question, and I'm not totally sure how to answer that. I know that within rhetoric of health and medicine, there is sort of an important movement towards social responsibility, and thinking about the public uses of our work, how we can interface with researchers in other disciplines. And I mean, for me, it's a hard question to answer. I think because I don't want to be prescriptive. I don't want to say that we are bound by. I know that there is a movement within rhetoric of health and medicine to consider whether or not there should be some kind of code of professional ethics. And I don't know, that's a debate that I guess it doesn't interest me. I guess I wouldn't want to think of my research as compelled in some way, but of course it is. And I think of Richard Weaver, mid-20th century rhetorician, who said that men, mid-20th century, but men are driven by a sense of the ought, that men are naturally rhetoricians. All people are naturally rhetoricians because we are, among other things, driven by a sense of the ought. And I think that there is, in rhetorical analysis, there is that sense of how things ought to be or how things could be. I think that's what drives a lot of our work, is looking at how does language, or how do forms of communication, or how do objects or people or places, how do they help shape belief and behaviors in particular ways, and what might their effects be? And I think even just to engage in that kind of study is itself it's important work, because it's trying to think of how do we imagine things could otherwise and maybe more effectively be. So that sense of responsibility, again, it's not something I've really thought about, I guess, that explicitly. All of my work is driven by that, though, I guess, if you think about how do the ways that we think about health and healthcare affect who we are as people, and how do we incorporate those identities, how do we make decisions about our bodies and about our lives that are influenced by all of these different factors that can be really hard to see at first glance until you really kind of start to pull them apart. So do we have a sense of responsibility? I mean, I guess in a way we do. I think that's what motivates us in our work. Mm-hmm. That's kind of a non-answer answer. But that's about as far as I've taken it, really.
Yeah, that was great. So you've touched a little bit on some of your other work and your larger project on wellness and illness, and a little bit about what this next book project is going to look like. So can you give our audience a little bit of a sense for how this particular article fits into your larger project on wellness and illness?
Yes. So, I mean, I'm still thinking this through a little bit. Part of it is I'm kind of in the middle of a seismic shift in the book project, because originally when I came up with the chapters, I had been thinking they'd be more topical. And now I'm thinking that they're going to be more looking at what I'm calling the different vectors of wellness discourse. And what I'm kind of drawing on that sort of contagion language of vector to think about how do rhetorics of wellness circulate, and what are the different components of the larger framework of rhetorics of wellness. Originally I was going to have a chapter on bioidentical hormone replacement or natural, the idea of natural menopause, a chapter on diets and those kinds of things. And I'm still going to talk all about them, but I think what would be more interesting and important for us to know is how does wellness discourse circulate in a broader sense? And so I've been thinking a lot about different, there are different models in rhetoric for thinking about the circulation of ideas. So I'm thinking about Rickart's ambient rhetoric, the idea of rhetorical percolation, which is Robin Jensen. So assemblage theory. So I've been thinking about these different ways of thinking about the circulation of wellness, and autopoiesis, I think, fits in this as well. And so I'm looking at different vectors of wellness discourse as different mechanisms for kind of driving this discourse. And so I've been thinking, for example, about wellness as a form of self-management. And so there I'm thinking about, and this is something I talk about in the article a little bit, but in a much more expanded sense about neoliberal self-governance and health citizenship, and that as governments have increasingly downloaded responsibility for health onto individual citizens who are then reframed as consumers, what happens to the idea of health itself? How does that circulate, and how does that change how we think of ourselves and our bodies? So that's one of the vectors. Another of the vectors is health and wellness, of course, as a new form of illness, and this is something I talk about in the article. And here I'm expanding on Spicer and Setterstrom's book, The Wellness Syndrome, where they talk about wellness as kind of a form of illness. And so I think when we expand the idea of wellness, I think we expand ways in which we can be ill. So now no longer do we need to monitor things like our blood pressure, our cholesterol level, our weight, but now we need to monitor our mood and our energy level and our sex life. And you can get apps for tracking all of these things. So you can rate your last sexual encounter. How good was it? What number would you give it? And I think that we're increasingly invited to imagine our bodies as, always open to improvement. There's no ceiling, in that respect. So that's another of the vectors. Another is to go back to that one, wellness as a new form of illness, we can talk about expansion of diagnostic categories. So how diagnostic categories grow can do numerous things, among which are increase health anxiety. Right. So I think we've all become very, very health anxious and very health aware in a way that I don't know if it benefits us in the ways that we think it does. And then there's the idea of self-enhancement. I talk about that in the article as well. So the book is expanding that as one of the vectors. So there, the idea of the tensions between risk and optimization. And then health and wellness as performance, like I talked about earlier. So there, I'd be drawing on notions of piety, of being a good, of being responsible for yourself and performing that sort of responsibility for others, self-branding as an element of that. But then also, because I'm not just purely cynical, I think that health and wellness is a survival strategy. I think it's how we cope with our lives. And I'm thinking here a lot, in this part of the project, I've been thinking a lot about Lauren Berlant's chapter in Metzel and Kirkland's book, Against Health. The full title is Against Health, How Health Became the New Morality. And in that book, Lauren Berlant has a chapter about obesity. And she talks about how, what if we saw, obesity for example, but what if we saw so-called bad health behaviors of any type as not, in her words, not a sign of someone's disregarding their life, but of being attached to life, that they want to carve out a space for pleasure in an otherwise unrewarding day-to-day life.
Wow.
And I found that chapter absolutely thrilling to think about how else might we envision health, and how we get through the day, right? And so I think wellness is a strategy of survival. I think it's a way of making us feel like we have some agency, that we have some autonomy, as a way of um, counteracting exhaustion, emotional exhaustion, physical exhaustion, financial exhaustion. And so I think that that is a really important part of the project as well.
That's fantastic. This is just an incredible project. So thank you so much for talking with me today about it. I just want to remind everyone who's watching that Colleen's article, The Self-Generating Language of Wellness and Natural Health, will be in this first issue of Rhetoric in Health and Medicine. Colleen's current book is already out, Bounding Biomedicine, and then the latest book project, The Wellness Drug, Natural Health in a Biomedical Culture. So very exciting stuff. Thank you so much, Colleen.
Thanks for chatting with me.